It's the year 1900. You're a Greek sponge diver. You're somewhere between the islands of Crete and mainland Greece near a tiny rocky island called Antikythera. The sea is rough, the season is getting late, and you and your crew are just trying to find one last good haul of sponges before you call it a year. You dive, and at about 45 meters down you find a shipwreck, an ancient one, and it's full of treasure, marble statues, bronze sculptures, glassware, pottery, coins. You surface and you cannot believe what you found. You spend the next several months pulling incredible artifacts up from the seafloor. And among all those statues and pottery and bronze pieces, someone pulls up what looks like a lump of corroded rock with some gears in it. Gears, mechanical gears, from a shipwreck that is 2,000 years old. For a while, nobody quite knows what to do with that. They set it aside. They focus on the statues, because obviously the statues are the impressive part, right? The gears can wait. The gears waited about 50 years before someone realized they were holding what might be the single most astonishing technological artifact ever discovered. A device so advanced, so sophisticated, so far ahead of everything else we know from its era, that its existence has genuinely forced historians to rethink what ancient people were capable of. Not once, not twice, but continuously for over 100 years. Every time someone builds a better scanner and looks at this thing more closely, they find something that makes them sit down quietly and reconsider everything. Welcome back to Mystique History. Today we are talking about the Antikythera Mechanism, the 2,000-year-old device that should not exist. The ancient Greek analog computer that tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, and 5 planets, predicted solar and lunar eclipses with stunning accuracy, displayed the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games, and did all of this through a system of interlocking bronze gears that demonstrates a level of mechanical engineering sophistication that Europe would not rediscover for over 1,000 years. Yeah, let's get into this. First, some context, because the Antikythera mechanism doesn't make sense without understanding when it was built and what the world looked like at that moment. We're talking somewhere between 150 and 60 BCE, the Hellenistic period, the Greek world after Alexander the Great, a time when Greek science, mathematics, and astronomy were genuinely the most advanced in the Western world. Names like Archimedes, Hipparchus, Eratosthenes, these weren't myths. These were real working scientists and mathematicians who were doing things that were startlingly sophisticated. Eratosthenes, for example, calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy around 240 BCE using nothing but shadows, a stick, and geometry. Hipparchus, who lived roughly a century before the Antikythera mechanism was built, developed incredibly precise models of the movements of the sun and moon, including accounting for the irregularity of the moon's orbit. Archimedes, the legendary mathematician of Syracuse, was known from ancient written sources to have built mechanical devices that modeled the movements of celestial bodies. We always assumed those references were slightly exaggerated legends. The Antikythera mechanism suggests they were not exaggerated at all. The shipwreck itself, based on the cargo, is dated to around 60 to 70 BCE. The ship was probably traveling from somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, possibly Rhodes or the Greek islands, toward Rome. Rhodes is particularly interesting because it was one of the great centers of Greek scientific and mechanical knowledge in this period. Multiple ancient writers specifically mentioned that Rhodes was known for mechanical marvels and sophisticated astronomical instruments. So the idea that something like the Antikythera mechanism came out of the Rhodian intellectual tradition is not at all a stretch. Now let's talk about what this thing actually is physically, because that matters before we can talk about what it does. When it was pulled from the water in pieces starting in 1901, it consisted of 82 surviving fragments of what was originally a single device. The whole thing, when reconstructed, would have been roughly the size of a thick hardcover book. Think about the dimensions of something like a large dictionary or a really beefy laptop. Bronze gears, at least 30 of them that we can identify, possibly significantly more in the original complete device. All enclosed in a wooden case with bronze plates on the front and back covered in inscriptions. Dials on the exterior that displayed various astronomical and calendrical information. Hand-operated, probably turned by a small crank on the side. Here's a thing that will break your brain a little. The gears inside the Antikythera mechanism include one that has 223 teeth. 223. That's not a round number. That's not something you arrive at by accident. 223 is the number of lunar months in what astronomers call the Saros cycle, which is the precise period after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat in the same pattern. 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. The ancient Greeks didn't just know about the Saros cycle. They built a gear with exactly the right number of teeth to mechanically compute it. Mechanically. In bronze. 2,000 years ago. The craftsman who cut those 223 teeth into that gear. That person was not just following instructions. That person understood what they were doing and why every single tooth mattered. That level of precision, that marriage of mathematical knowledge and mechanical skill, is extraordinary in any era. Let me walk you through what the Antikythera mechanism could actually display and calculate, because the full list is almost comically ambitious for a hand-cranked bronze box from 100 BCE. The front face had a large main dial showing the Egyptian calendar year of 365 days. On an outer ring that could be adjusted for the slight drift between the Egyptian calendar and the actual solar year. It also showed the Greek zodiac, so you could read the position of the sun against the stars at any given time. Move the crank forward a day, the sun advances through the zodiac. Move it a month, you can read where the sun sits relative to the stars. Move it a year, you can track the full cycle. But that's just the front, and it's the straightforward part. The back face is where things get truly wild. The upper back dial displayed the Metonic cycle. The Metonic cycle is 235 lunar months, which is almost exactly 19 solar years, and it's used to reconcile the lunar calendar with the solar year. Basically, it's the solution to the problem of lunar calendars drifting out of sync with the seasons. The Metonic cycle tells you when the lunar calendar resets to the same solar position, so you can use it to keep your calendar aligned with agriculture, religion, and civil life across many years. The Antikythera mechanism's back dial showed you exactly where you were in that 19-year cycle. Nested inside the Metonic cycle dial was a smaller dial showing the Callipic cycle, which is 4 Metonic cycles, or 76 years, an even longer-range calendar correction tool, also tracked, also displayed. Below that, another large dial. This one showed the Saros cycle for eclipse prediction. 223 months, as we talked about. You could use this dial to predict when the next solar eclipse was coming and when the next lunar eclipse was coming, and roughly how significant each would be. There was even a subsidiary dial within the Saros display showing a 54-year triple Saros cycle called the Exeligmos, which refined the eclipse predictions even further. And there was another small dial showing the 4-year Olympiad cycle, the cycle of the Olympic Games and the other Panhellenic Games that were the cornerstone of Greek cultural and religious life, the Isthmian Games, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games. The device tracked sporting events. The world's first calendar app had a sports schedule built in. I genuinely don't know what to do with that information, but it delights me every single time. Oh, and there's one more function that researchers identified more recently through advanced imaging. The mechanism also tracked the movements of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The planetary gearing was probably some of the most complex in the whole device, and most of it has been lost to corrosion and fragmentation. but the evidence for it is there in the surviving fragments and in the inscriptions on the back of the device that describe planetary periods. If you are watching this channel and you have a subscribe button available to you, I just want you to know this is exactly the kind of thing we live for here, and there are many more of these stories where this came from. The total gear count in the original complete device, once you account for the planetary functions that are partially lost, has been estimated at up to 72 interlocking gears. 72. In a box the size of a hardback book. Handcrafted in bronze in the 1st century BCE. For a long time after the wreck was recovered, the fragments sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The corroded lump that would turn out to be the mechanism was initially noted and set aside. A French archaeologist named Albert Rame was the first person to seriously study the fragments around 1905 and suggest they might be part of some kind of astronomical calculator. But the significance wasn't widely appreciated. The scientific world wasn't ready to take seriously the idea that ancient Greeks had mechanical computing devices this sophisticated. It wasn't until the 1950s that a British science historian named Derek de Solla Price got his hands on the fragments and dedicated years of careful study to trying to understand what they were. In 1959, he published a paper, and then in 1974, a much more detailed study in which he argued definitively that this was a sophisticated astronomical calculating machine. He called it, and I love this, a great-grandfather of all computers. The academic community's reaction was cautious. Some people were genuinely excited. Others were frankly resistant to the idea because it disrupted too many assumptions about ancient technology. The real revolution in understanding came in 2006 when a large international team of researchers used cutting-edge X-ray tomography and surface imaging technology to penetrate the corrosion and read inscriptions and gear structures that had been invisible to the naked eye. The Antikythera research team, as they called themselves, published results that absolutely transformed what we know about the device. Thousands of characters of inscription that had been hidden inside the corroded fragments were revealed for the first time. The full function of many gears became clear. The planetary tracking capabilities were confirmed. The sports calendar was identified. The level of mechanical sophistication was established beyond any remaining serious doubt. Since then, the research has never stopped. In 2021, a team from University College London published a reconstruction of the front panel planetary gearing that finally proposed a complete and coherent mechanism for how the 5 planets were tracked. Their physical reconstruction, which they actually built using ancient tools and techniques as much as possible, worked. It worked exactly as predicted. A 2,000-year-old mechanism successfully rebuilt from fragments and mathematical deduction, and when you put it together and turn the crank, the sun moves correctly through the zodiac. The moon phases change at the right rate. The eclipses appear when they're supposed to, and the planets trace their paths through the sky. Just like it did when someone built it the first time, somewhere in the Greek world, 100 years before the birth of Jesus. One of the questions that has never been fully resolved is, who specifically designed and built this thing? The short answer is, we don't know and may never know. The longer answer is genuinely interesting. The ancient Greek world had a rich tradition of automata and mechanical devices. Archimedes is credited with building multiple mechanical planetaria. Ancient writers describe incredible mechanical creations from various workshops across the Hellenistic world: animated bronze birds, mechanical servants, self-moving devices for theatrical performances. Most of these we know only from written descriptions because none have survived. The Antikythera Mechanism is the exception, the one that ended up at the bottom of the ocean in cold, dark water and didn't corrode completely away before we found it. The island of Rhodes comes up most often in discussions of the mechanism's origin. Cicero, the Roman philosopher and politician, actually wrote around 60 BCE, right around the time the shipwreck occurred, about watching a mechanical sphere that displayed the movements of the sun, moon, and planets that had been built by Posidonius, a philosopher based in Rhodes. He also referenced that Archimedes had built similar devices previously. The timing and location are almost too perfect to be coincidental. The ship that sank at Antikythera was traveling a route consistent with coming from Rhodes. The mechanism's astronomical data sets are calibrated for a Mediterranean latitude consistent with Rhodes or Corinth. The calendar dial includes games that were specifically associated with Corinth and the broader Greek world. Here is something that the ancient sources tell us that gives this even more weight. There was a tradition, apparently well known in the ancient world, of teachers demonstrating the movements of the cosmos to their students using mechanical models. Philosophy and astronomy weren't just theoretical in the Greek tradition, they were demonstrated. The cosmos was shown to be comprehensible, ordered, mathematical, and therefore divine in the Greek philosophical sense. A device like the Antikythera Mechanism wasn't just a scientific instrument, it was a philosophical statement made physical. It was saying, in bronze and gears and inscribed instructions, that the universe moves according to rules that human minds can understand and human hands can replicate. That's not a small statement. That is one of the foundational ideas of Western science, that nature is comprehensible, that its patterns can be studied, modeled, and predicted. The Antikythera Mechanism is perhaps the earliest surviving physical embodiment of that idea, which is why calling it an ancient computer isn't just a catchy headline. It's actually conceptually accurate. A computer is a device that processes information according to rules to produce a predictable output. That is exactly what the Antikythera Mechanism does. It just uses gears instead of transistors, and you power it with your hand instead of electricity. What makes the device even more staggering when you really sit with it is the implied ecosystem around it. One device like this doesn't exist in isolation. You don't build something this sophisticated without a tradition of similar work, without workshops capable of producing precision bronze gears, without astronomers whose observations are good enough to derive the exact gear ratios needed, without a customer class wealthy and educated enough to commission and use such a device. The Antikythera Mechanism implies an entire world of ancient precision engineering and astronomical scholarship that we have almost no other physical evidence for, because it didn't survive. Think about that for a moment. What if dozens of devices like this existed? What if every major philosophical school in the Greek world had one? What if Hellenistic-era Rome had mechanical planetary displays as common household items among the educated wealthy, the same way educated people today might have a sophisticated telescope or a high-end weather station? We would never know, because bronze, unlike stone, gets melted down, because wood rots, because the medieval period was not particularly interested in preserving pagan scientific instruments, because the ocean floor off Antikythera happened to be cold enough and the wreck happened to be covered with sediment in exactly the right way to preserve one surviving fragment of a technological tradition that might have been far more widespread than we can currently imagine. The mechanism's inscriptions, which have been partially translated and interpreted, include what appears to be a user manual of sorts, instructions for reading the dials, explanations of what the various cycles mean. This wasn't just built for one specific expert astronomer who already knew how everything worked. It was built to be used and understood by someone who needed guidance. It was designed to be educational as well as functional. A teaching tool, a demonstrational device, something you'd bring out to show people how the cosmos works and have them turn the crank and watch the sun and moon and planets move in their correct relationships to each other. Imagine being a student in a Greek philosophical school in 100 BCE, and your teacher puts one of these on the table and says, Turn the crank forward 30 years and tell me where Mars will be. And you can, because the machine knows. Because someone sat down with the astronomical observations of Hipparchus and the mathematical traditions of Babylonian astronomy before him, and worked out exactly how many teeth each gear needed to have, and built a machine that carries the knowledge of the cosmos in bronze. The Babylonian connection is real, by the way, and it's important. The Saros cycle that the mechanism uses for eclipse prediction, that was originally worked out by Babylonian astronomers over centuries of systematic sky observation. Greek astronomy in the Hellenistic period was partly built on knowledge that had been accumulated in Mesopotamia for hundreds of years before that. The Antikythera Mechanism, in a very real sense, represents a synthesis of the Babylonian mathematical astronomical tradition and the Greek mechanical engineering tradition. It is a piece of technology that carries within its gears the accumulated astronomical knowledge of multiple civilizations over hundreds of years. That's what keeps researchers coming back to this device decade after decade. Every time imaging technology improves, every time a new interdisciplinary team looks at it with fresh eyes, they find another layer, another inscription that reveals another function, another gear relationship that suggests another calculation. The Antikythera research continues to this day. There are still fragments that haven't been fully analyzed. There are still questions about the complete planetary display that don't have final answers. There are still researchers who believe there may be functions of the mechanism we haven't yet identified or fully understood. One fascinating ongoing debate is about whether the mechanism's design represents a single unique genius invention, or whether it was the product of an established tradition. In other words, was this a lone Archimedes-level invention by some singular brilliant person? Or was this more like the iPhone, the culmination of a long development tradition, building on earlier devices and previous generations of similar mechanisms? Most researchers today lean toward the latter. The sophistication of the Antikythera mechanism is too complete, too refined, to be a first-generation prototype. This is a mature technology, which means there were earlier, simpler versions, which means there was a workshop tradition, which means there were people whose job was building devices like this, and essentially none of that has survived. The original 82 fragments of the Antikythera mechanism are still in Athens at the National Archaeological Museum. They're displayed there, and you can visit them. The Antikythera shipwreck site has also been the subject of renewed underwater archaeological investigation in recent years. A project called the Antikythera Shipwreck Project, using sophisticated modern diving technology, has returned to the site and continued to find artifacts. Human skeletal remains were found there in 2016, the remains of one of the people who were on that ship when it went down 2,000 years ago. DNA from those bones was successfully extracted and analyzed. The ship continues to give up its secrets slowly, fragment by fragment, bone by bone. There are full working reconstructions of the Antikythera mechanism in museums around the world. Several universities have built them. The UCL team I mentioned built one. You can watch videos of them turning the crank and watching the dials move. There is something about watching a physical reconstruction of a 2,000-year-old device actually functioning, gears turning, dials rotating, correctly displaying the position of the moon and the phase of the eclipse cycle, that hits you somewhere very deep. It's not just impressive engineering, it's something more than that. It's evidence that human minds 2,000 years ago wanted the same things that human minds want today. They wanted to understand how the universe works. They wanted to predict the future, to know when the eclipse was coming, to track the planets, to keep time across great spans of years. They wanted to hold the cosmos in their hands and turn a small crank and say, "I understand this. I have modeled this. I can predict this." That impulse didn't wait for silicon chips and programming languages. It expressed itself in bronze gears and astronomical tables, and a wooden box about the size of a hardback book on a ship somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea 2,000 years ago. And then it sank, and waited, and waited, for sponge divers and scientists and archaeologists and imaging technology and patient decades of scholarship to say, "We see you, we found you, and we're starting to understand." The mechanism still has things to tell us. The research is not finished, but what it has already told us is more than enough to shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about ancient technology, about the continuity of human intellectual ambition, and about what gets lost and what, against all odds, survives. A corroded lump of bronze that looked like a rock, the most astonishing piece of technology from the ancient world ever recovered, still sitting in Athens, still being studied, still full of secrets. Some things are worth waiting 2,000 years for. Okay, I genuinely need to know, what is your reaction to this thing? Because when I first learned about the Antikythera Mechanism, I had to take a walk around the block to process it. Drop a comment with ancient tech if this rewired your brain the way it rewired mine, and tell me what you think is the most astonishing part of this story. The gear with 223 teeth? The Olympic Games calendar? The fact that similar devices might have existed everywhere and we just lost them all? Tell me. And if you want to keep going down these rabbit holes with us every week, every single one of which is going to make you rethink something you thought you knew about history, then you know where the subscribe button is. Mystique History is right here, and we are not even close to running out of stories. The past is so much stranger and so much more brilliant than any textbook ever told you, and we are going to explore every single corner of it together. See you in the next one.